There's a specific kind of frustration that comes from watching someone get dismissed for being early, and then watching the thing they warned about arrive right on schedule while the people who called them paranoid quietly go silent. That's the story sitting underneath Linus Torvalds and Microsoft in 2026. And I want to be careful about how I frame this because it's not a grudge story, and it's not really about open source idealism versus corporate pragmatism either. It's a story about power, how large technology companies acquire it, how they use it once they have it, and why one engineer who spent his entire career building an operating system designed to keep users in control saw the end game. Clearly back in 2001, while most of the tech press was still reading Microsoft's press releases at face value. Here's why this conversation is urgent right now instead of just historical trivia. Microsoft isn't just a software company anymore. As of 2026, it functions as the infrastructure layer underneath the entire AI industry. The company's total commitment to OpenAI, once around $13 billion, has grown into a partnership now valued north of $100 billion, once you count the Azure infrastructure built to run OpenAI's models. Microsoft has woven AI systems into Windows, Office, Edge, Azure, and GitHub, the platform it bought in 2018 for $7.5 billion and which remains the largest home for open source software development on the planet. Every one of those integrations asks for something the old, pre-cloud Microsoft could only have dreamed of collecting at this scale. Your documents, your emails, your code, your search behavior, flowing through infrastructure Microsoft owns, processed by models Microsoft controls, governed by data policies Microsoft writes. Linus Torvalds warned about exactly this shape of architecture decades before any of these specific products existed. Not the feature names, obviously. Nobody could have predicted something called Recall or Copilot in 2001, but the structural logic, the pattern of behavior, the end game of what Microsoft was building toward, that part he called early and consistently. He said it in 2001, when almost nobody in mainstream tech media took the warning seriously. He said some version of it again in 2014, when Satya Nadella took over with a friendlier tone, and much of the industry decided the old battles were simply over. He said it when Microsoft bought GitHub and a large chunk of the open source world celebrated. The response from most of the technology press, for years, was to paint him as bitter, stuck in an old feud, unable to accept that a corporation could genuinely change. To understand why that dismissal was wrong, you have to go back to where this actually starts, because the origin point isn't just color commentary. It's the key to reading everything that came after. In October 2001, a set of internal Microsoft documents leaked to the open source community. They became known as the Halloween documents, named for when they surfaced, and they were never written for public consumption. They were internal strategy memos from Microsoft's own engineers and executives assessing Linux and open source software as a genuine competitive threat. What those documents revealed, stripped of the public corporate confidence Microsoft projected at the time, was a company that took the threat seriously enough to plan around it using a phrase that's since become a foundational shorthand for how large tech companies deal with open competitors they can't simply outcompete. Embrace, extend, extinguish. Adopt the language and some of the practices of the thing you want to defeat. Integrate with it deeply enough that people become dependent on your version of it. Then, once that dependency is locked in, make the open alternative irrelevant by controlling the layer sitting above it. Around that same period, then CEO Steve Ballmer delivered his now infamous comparison, describing Linux as a cancer that attaches itself, in an intellectual property sense, to everything it touches. That wasn't an offhand remark. It was a deliberate statement delivered to an audience that included enterprise customers. Microsoft was actively trying to steer away from Linux. Torvalds responded with his usual bluntness that Microsoft was the real threat to software freedom, that any developer trusting the company's promises about openness would eventually regret it, and that a corporation's core objective is always to maximize control over the environment it operates in, the technology. Press mostly framed this as the idealist versus the pragmatists. 25 years of documented evidence later, that framing looks less like analysis and more like a company successfully managing its own narrative. Microsoft's image rehabilitation didn't happen by accident. It began the moment Satya Nadella replaced Steve Ballmer as CEO in February 2014, and it was deliberate, well-executed strategic repositioning. And I want to be fair here, because some of what happened during the Nadella era was genuinely real, not just spin. The kernel contributions were real. Open sourcing.net in November 2014 was real. Visual Studio Code, which by multiple developer surveys has become the most widely used code editor in the world, was a genuinely useful gift to the open source community. The Windows subsystem for Linux, letting developers run a real Linux environment inside Windows without a virtual machine, solved an actual daily problem for a huge number of people working across both ecosystems. None of that was theater. But here's the distinction Torvalds kept drawing that most of the tech press never quite engaged with. The question was never whether Microsoft could produce genuinely useful open source work. Obviously it could, and did. The question was what all of that contribution was building toward, and whether the embrace had an endpoint that served users, or one that served Microsoft's long-term control over the infrastructure layer. Every article that said Linus was wrong, Microsoft has changed in 2018, and 2019 was answering a question nobody in the skeptical camp had actually asked. Nobody said Microsoft was incapable of shipping good open source tools. The claim was that once sufficient control over the infrastructure was established, the open contributions would stop being the point. Looking at what's happened since 2020, that specific prediction has aged with a precision that should unsettle more people than it currently does. The GitHub acquisition is where you can watch the pivot happen in real time, in hindsight. When Microsoft bought GitHub in June 2018 for $7.5 billion, the open source community split between cautious optimism and real alarm. The optimists pointed to Microsoft's recent track record. The skeptics pointed to the structural reality. The world's largest proprietary software company now owned the infrastructure through which the overwhelming majority of open source collaboration happened. Microsoft's public promise was explicit. GitHub would stay independent. The community had nothing to worry about. For roughly 3 years, that promise appeared to hold. Then, in June 2021, Microsoft launched GitHub Copilot, an AI pair programming tool trained on billions of lines of code hosted on the platform. Code uploaded under licenses ranging from MIT to GPL to Apache, licenses written with human attribution and collaboration in mind, never written with the expectation that the code would become training. Data for a proprietary, subscription-based commercial product. The Free Software Foundation published a detailed analysis arguing this created a genuine license compliance problem Microsoft hadn't adequately addressed. A class action lawsuit alleging copyright violation and breach of open source license terms was filed in November 2022. That litigation has moved slowly through the U.S. court system since, with parts of the claims narrowed and others allowed to proceed. And as of 2026, developers whose code trained the model still have no mechanism for attribution, compensation, or opt-out. What matters beyond the legal specifics is what the whole episode revealed about the actual architecture of Microsoft's open source strategy. The community spent years building a shared resource. Microsoft acquired the infrastructure hosting it with public promises of independence, and then used that infrastructure and the data inside it to build a proprietary product generating subscription revenue that flows exclusively back to Microsoft. That's not an accident. That's a product decision made at the highest levels of the company, and it maps almost exactly onto the embrace, extend, monetize pattern Torvalds had described 2 decades earlier. The Windows story running in parallel tells the same structural story with less attention paid to it, because it doesn't live in developer tool coverage. Windows 11, launched in October 2021, arrived with account and telemetry requirements, representing the biggest shift in Microsoft's relationship with its users since mandatory activation in Windows XP. A Microsoft account became required during setup, with workarounds progressively closed off in later updates. Telemetry collection, already expanded under Windows 10, became non-negotiable for professional users too, with the group policy options to fully disable it quietly removed. OneDrive integration deepened with every update. Edge kept reinstalling itself after removal attempts. Default app assignments kept resetting after system updates. Each of those choices is defensible in isolation. Stacked together across 4+ years of Windows 11 updates running through 2025 and into 2026, they describe exactly the structural evolution Torvalds had predicted back when. Almost nobody was listening. A platform that preserves the visual interface of user choice while steadily moving actual execution authority back to the company that owns the infrastructure. And that pattern didn't stay confined to telemetry settings and default browsers. By 2024, it had a name, a hardware category, and a headline feature that turned an abstract architectural argument into something you could point to on a real device. That feature was recall. Recall is the moment the architectural momentum of the previous years broke into public view in a way nobody could look away from, and the way it was rolled out tells you more about Microsoft's actual priorities than any keynote script could. When Microsoft announced Recall in May 2024 as the flagship capability of its new Copilot PC hardware category, the pitch sounded almost irresistible. Your machine would capture a screenshot every few seconds, run local OCR through a dedicated neural processing unit, and build a searchable timeline of everything you'd ever done on the computer. Lost a document from last Thursday? Ask the AI. Trying to recall a paragraph from a website you visited 3 weeks ago? Ask the AI. What the marketing left out were the implementation details that independent security researchers uncovered within days. Kevin Beaumont, a former senior threat intelligence analyst at Microsoft, whose findings were widely reported across technology media, showed that the initial version of Recall stored its entire screenshot history in an unencrypted local database, accessible to any application running with standard user privileges. Another researcher built an automated tool that could extract months of continuous screen history, plain text passwords, financial records, decrypted messages, active session tokens, in under 2 minutes, requiring no privilege escalation, just the kind of basic code execution common malware achieves routinely through phishing. The UK Information Commissioner's Office opened an inquiry in June 2024. Security professionals pointed out correctly that the data collection engine was functionally indistinguishable from the kind of spyware enterprise security teams spend millions of dollars trying to detect and remove. Microsoft's response followed almost exactly the pattern Torvalds had described decades earlier. Delay, redesign, reintroduce with real but partial improvements, present the whole cycle as evidence of responsiveness to community feedback. The company pushed the rollout back into insider channels, added database encryption tied to Windows Hello, restricted key access through virtualization-based security, enclaves, and built heuristic filters meant to scrub sensitive fields like financial forms before shipping a redesigned version as an opt-in feature on compatible hardware through 2025. Those changes were real in a narrow technical sense. But when independent researchers tested the updated version, meaningful gaps remained. The encryption could still be bypassed with just a PIN code in setups without biometric authentication configured, which described a large share of real-world deployments, and the sensitive data filters continued to miss financial and credential information they were specifically built to catch. The improved version was, by multiple independent assessments, still a comprehensive surveillance system running continuously in the background on millions of devices, just a better defended one than the version that launched. Then, in March 2026, a very similar pattern surfaced somewhere developers assumed they were safe from it, GitHub itself. Reporting that spread quickly across developer communities revealed that GitHub Copilot had been quietly injecting promotional content into pull requests. An Australian developer discovered that after a colleague asked the tool to fix a simple typo, it added an unsolicited plug for a separate Microsoft productivity product. The search of public repositories turned up the injected phrase in more than 11,000 pull requests, with broader analysis putting the real total above 1.5 million affected pull requests across the platform. Microsoft called it a logic bug. Developers, many of whom had spent years defending GitHub's stewardship under Microsoft, as evidence the company had, genuinely changed, called it something closer to a breach of the basic trust a coding tool requires to function at all. Because if a tool is writing your code, you need to trust it's writing only your code and nothing else. That trust erosion shows up in adoption numbers too. Independent survey data through 2025 and into 2026 has consistently found that when developers and knowledge workers have genuine, unforced access to Copilot alongside rival AI tools, the overwhelming majority choose something else. Figures cited across multiple 2026 industry surveys put Copilot's voluntary adoption share in the single digits when it's competing head-to-head rather than being pre-installed and mandated by an employer. Meanwhile, Copilot's own accuracy trust scores, tracked independently through 2025 and early 2026, spent significant stretches in negative territory, meaning that people who actually tried it were, on balance, more likely to warn a colleague away from it than recommend it. Here's what I think is genuinely important to be honest about, though, because it complicates the neat narrative rather than confirming it cleanly. Torvalds himself, in 2026, has not been positioning himself as some kind of angry prophet watching his warnings come true. If anything, his own public tone toward both Microsoft and AI has gotten notably more relaxed. He appeared on a casual YouTube interview in early 2026, building a PC and describing what he called a genuinely friendly relationship with Microsoft's kernel contributors. At the Open Source Summit in Minneapolis in May 2026, he pushed back hard against the opposite extreme too, the claim, increasingly common among some startups, that 99% of our code is AI generated, calling that framing nonsense, comparing it to claiming 100% of your code is written by a compiler, and arguing AI is a powerful tool that raises the floor of what developers can build without lowering the ceiling on what they actually need to understand. He's even used AI coding tools himself on personal side projects, admitting in January 2026 that a Python visualizer for a hobby audio effects project was, in his own words, basically written by vibe coding. So the honest version of this story isn't that Torvalds has spent 2026 loudly saying, "I told you so," about Microsoft's AI push specifically. It's something a little more interesting than that. The structural pattern he identified 25 years ago. Embrace the open thing, extend it until people depend on your version, then use the control that dependency buys you. Keeps showing up in Microsoft's own product decisions, independently of whatever Torvalds himself happens to be saying about AI on any given week. The pattern doesn't need him to keep narrating it. The evidence just keeps arriving on its own schedule. So where does that leave the actual argument at the center of this video? Is Torvalds right about Microsoft, even if he's personally stopped sounding like the loudest voice making that case? I think the honest answer is yes, and I think the reason is more unsettling than a simple grudge story would be, because it means the pattern was never really about one company's intentions in any given year. It was about incentive structures, and incentive structures don't need a specific villain to keep producing the same outcome. Look at what's actually piled up by mid-2026. Windows telemetry remains effectively mandatory for professional users who've explicitly tried to disable it. Recall exists on Copilot Plus hardware in a meaningfully improved but still imperfect state, still capturing a running record of a user's digital life, still occasionally missing sensitive data its own filters were built to catch. The GitHub Copilot promotional injection story from March 2026 shows the exact same embrace then monetize logic playing out on a platform built entirely on the trust of the developers who use it, a trust Microsoft spent years explicitly promising it would protect when it bought GitHub in 2018. The class action litigation over Copilot's training data, filed back in November 2022, is still working its way through the courts years later, unresolved. And Microsoft's own Copilot product, the one meant to be the centerpiece of its entire AI strategy, embedded across Word, Excel, Outlook, Teams, and Windows, has, by multiple independent measures through 2025 and 2026, struggled badly to win voluntary adoption from the very users it was bundled in front of, even as the company kept describing it publicly as thriving. None of that requires Linus Torvalds to personally be angry about it in any given week for the underlying claim to hold up. That's actually the more important insight buried in this story, and it's one the reference-heavy was he right or wrong framing tends to miss. Torvalds never argued that Microsoft was staffed by cartoonishly villainous executives twirling mustaches over quarterly planning documents. He argued something more structural and, frankly, more boring sounding, but ultimately more accurate, that a corporation's fundamental incentive is to maximize control over the environment it operates in, and that individual good faith engineers, individual well-intentioned product decisions, and individual genuinely useful open source contributions can all be real, at the same time that the aggregate direction of the company still bends toward tighter control, deeper lock-in, and less user autonomy. You don't need a conspiracy for that pattern to emerge. You just need a company big enough and profitable enough that the incentive structure quietly does the work on its own, one product roadmap at a time. That's also, I think, why Torvalds' own more measured, even friendly 2026 tone toward Microsoft's kernel contributors doesn't actually undercut the argument. It might even strengthen it. He's never claimed Microsoft can't do genuinely good collaborative engineering work. The Windows subsystem for Linux and the kernel contributions were real, and he said so. What he flagged, decades before any of this existed as a product, was the mechanism by which genuinely good engineering work can coexist with an increasingly tight grip on the infrastructure layer underneath it. Recall being meaningfully improved doesn't refute that mechanism. It's the mechanism working exactly as described. Embrace the criticism, extend a real fix, keep the underlying architecture of control intact. Where does that leave you, watching this in July 2026, deciding what to actually do with your own machine, your own code, your own data? I don't think the honest takeaway is boycott Microsoft or everything the company ships is secretly malicious. That's not what the evidence supports. And it's not what Torvalds himself has argued, then or now. The more useful takeaway is closer to what he's been saying consistently for 25 years, stripped of the specific product names. Pay attention to the direction a company's incentives point, not just the individual feature announcements. A single recall redesign, a single Copilot pricing change, a single GitHub statement about training data. None of those, on their own, tell you much. But watched together, across years as a pattern, they tell you almost everything about where the control is actually flowing and who benefits when it gets there. Microsoft's roughly $13 billion original stake in OpenAI is reportedly worth many multiples of that today, and the company's position as the infrastructure layer beneath a huge share of the modern AI industry is arguably stronger in 2026 than it's ever been, whether that turns out to be a genuine win for the millions of people whose documents, code, and daily work increasingly run through that infrastructure, or whether it turns out to be the clearest version yet of the pattern Torvalds first named in 2001 is still being written in real time, product cycle by product cycle. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the pattern really has held for 25 straight years, at what point does it stop being a debate about whether Linus Torvalds was right and start being just an accurate description of how this specific company operates? Drop your take in the comments. And if you've made a deliberate choice about which parts of your digital life you keep off Microsoft's infrastructure, or you've decided the convenience is worth the trade-off, I'd genuinely like to know where you've drawn that line. If you want to keep tracking how this plays out as the Copilot story, the GitHub litigation, and the next hardware cycle all continue unfolding, stick around. Because on the evidence of the last 25 years, this pattern isn't done yet.